Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most misunderstood professions, the lighthouse keeper. You're probably imagining some peaceful old salt sitting by the ocean, maybe reading a book while occasionally glancing up to make sure the light's still on. Well, you're about to discover that fantasy is about as accurate as expecting a relaxing vacation in a tornado. Picture yourself standing at the base of a towering stone cylinder in 1850, oil-stained lantern, in one hand heavy canvas bag of supplies, in the other staring up at what might as well be a vertical marathon that you'll be running multiple times every single day for the rest of your working life. The spiral staircase above you winds up 6, 7, sometimes 8 flights, and at the top waits a collection of glass lenses that cost more than most people's houses' lenses that absolutely must stay clean, bright, and operational every second of every day because ships full of sailors are counting on that beacon to guide them safely past the rocks that have already claimed countless vessels and their crews. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment, letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this little community spans the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You accept the position because the alternative, whatever soul-crushing job you were doing on land, seemed worse than this isolated posting. The Lighthouse service promises steady pay-free housing and the kind of solitude that feels appealing when you're sick of dealing with other people's problems. What they don't mention in the job description is that you'll be carrying approximately 1 ton of coal per day up those stairs during winter months, or that the lens apparatus requires cleaning with such precision that a single smudge could mean the difference between a safe harbor and a maritime disaster. You quickly learn that lighthouse keeping isn't a job, it's a way of life that consumes every waking moment, and plenty of your sleeping ones too. Your first week teaches you the brutal arithmetic of the profession. 48 individual wicks need trimming twice daily. Each one burns whale oil that must be carefully measured and replenished. The glass panels surrounding the light collect salt spray and soot with relentless determination, requiring constant scrubbing with specialized cloths that cost more than you used to make in a month. You discover muscles in your legs you never knew existed as you climb those stairs, carrying buckets of oil cleaning supplies and spare parts. By day 3, your calves feel like someone's been beating them with hammers, and by day 7, you understand why lighthouse keepers develop that distinctive rolling gait. It's the only way to navigate stairs when your legs have been transformed into columns of pure agony. The routine becomes sacred because deviation means disaster. 3 in the morning, check the light trim wick's record weather conditions in the official log. 6 in the morning, same routine, plus temperature readings that must be transmitted to government weather stations. 9 in the morning, detailed equipment inspection and maintenance. Between these mandatory check-ins, you're painting, repairing, cleaning, and preparing for the next cycle. Historians still argue whether the lighthouse service's obsession with detailed record keeping actually improved maritime safety or just created busy work for isolated keepers. But you quickly learn not to question the system. Your job depends on following every regulation to the letter. The first time you encounter the Mercury system, you think someone's playing an elaborate practical joke. Your supervisor leads you to the lens room, where a massive Fresnel apparatus, those specially cut glass panels that can focus light with almost supernatural efficiency, sits balanced on what looks like a small swimming pool filled with liquid silver. "Don't worry," he says with the kind of casual tone people use when they're about to tell you something genuinely terrifying. "Just don't spill any of it, and try not to breathe too deeply when you're working up here." The Mercury allows the multi-ton lens system to rotate smoothly with minimal effort, creating those distinctive flashing patterns that help sailors identify specific lighthouses from miles away. What your supervisor doesn't mention is that you'll soon be handling this toxic metal with your bare hands on a regular basis, armed with nothing more than a dustpan and brush when the inevitable spills occur. The lens apparatus itself represents one of humanity's most brilliant optical achievements, concentrating nearly 83% of the light source into a focused beam that can be seen for 20 miles on a clear night. Augustin Fresnel's revolutionary design transformed lighthouse technology, but maintaining his masterpiece requires the kind of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. Every morning you climb to the lens room with your collection of specialized cloths, each designated for a specific part of the cleaning process. The glass panels must be spotless, not merely clean, but absolutely pristine, because even the smallest imperfection can scatter light and reduce the beacon's range. You learn to see fingerprints and salt deposits that would be invisible to normal human eyes, developing an almost supernatural sensitivity to anything that might interfere with the light's path. The rotation mechanism operates on a clockwork principle that requires winding multiple times per day. Heavy weights descend through the center of the lighthouse tower, turning gears that slowly rotate the entire lens assembly. When the weights reach the bottom, you must climb to the top and crank them back up, a process that takes considerable strength and leaves you gasping in the thin air of the lantern room. The timing must be perfect, too slow, and the light pattern becomes irregular, confusing approaching ships. Too fast and the mechanism wears out, prematurely leaving you with several tons of stationary glass and a very expensive repair bill that will definitely come out of your salary. But it's the Mercury that truly defines the nightmare aspects of your new profession. During storms, waves crash against the lighthouse with such force that the entire structure vibrates like a tuning fork. The Mercury responds to these vibrations by sloshing violently in its trough, sending droplets of liquid metal flying across the lens room. You quickly develop a routine for Mercury cleanup that involves carefully collecting each scattered bead with specialized tools, then purifying the recovered metal by squeezing it through chamois leather, a process that exposes you to mercury vapors while requiring the kind of precise hand movements that become increasingly difficult as the neurotoxin accumulates in your system. The early symptoms are subtle enough that you might attribute them to other causes. Your hands develop a slight tremor that you blame on fatigue from all that stair climbing. Your mood becomes unpredictable. One moment, you're contentedly maintaining the light. The next, you're irrationally angry at seabirds for existing. Sleep becomes elusive, interrupted by strange dreams and an overwhelming sense of anxiety that has no apparent source. Historians still argue whether mercury poisoning alone explains the notorious madness of lighthouse keepers, or if the combination of isolation, sleep deprivation, and toxic exposure created a perfect storm of mental deterioration. The phrase, mad as a hatter, takes on new meaning when you realize that hat makers and lighthouse keepers suffered from identical symptoms caused by identical exposure to mercury compounds. The difference is that hat makers worked in cramped, poorly ventilated shops, while you're supposedly benefiting from fresh ocean air. Unfortunately, that fresh air doesn't prevent mercury vapors from accumulating in your lungs during the hours you spend maintaining the lens apparatus in the enclosed lantern room. Your colleagues begin to seem increasingly odd. One develops an obsession with organizing supplies in elaborate patterns. Another starts conversations with people who aren't there. And a third becomes convinced that ships are deliberately trying to crash into the lighthouse just to annoy him. The storm that changes everything arrives on a Tuesday in October, though you lose track of days when the wind starts howling at speeds that make normal conversation impossible. You've weathered rough weather before, but this hurricane brings waves that defy everything you thought you knew about the ocean's capabilities. From your position in the lantern room, you watch walls of water rise higher than the lighthouse itself, 100-foot mountains of green-black fury that seem to pause at their peak before crashing down with the force of collapsing buildings. The entire tower shudders with each impact, and you find yourself gripping the lens apparatus for stability while trying to keep the light operational through conditions that would terrify seasoned sea captains. The lighthouse at Eddystone Rocks had already taught the engineering world harsh lessons about building structures that could survive oceanic tantrums. The first attempt secured to the rocks with 12 giant iron stanchions lasted exactly 4 years before a storm in 1703 simply erased it from existence along with its keepers. No traces were ever found, not of the building, not of the men who maintained it, nothing but empty rock where a functioning lighthouse had stood the day before. The second lighthouse managed a few decades before meeting the same fate, proving that the ocean doesn't negotiate with human engineering ambitions. Only John Smeaton's revolutionary design, completed in 1759, managed to last over a century by using lime concrete that could set underwater and a tapered profile that deflected wave energy rather than fighting it directly. You're experiencing firsthand why lighthouse construction became such a specialized field, requiring engineers who understood that normal building principles simply don't apply when your foundation might disappear underwater during high tide. The waves hitting your lighthouse thus aren't just large, they're arriving with mathematical precision that creates resonance effects in the tower structure. Every 7th or 8th wave hits with extra force, setting up vibrations that travel through the stone and iron framework like seismic tremors. You learn to brace yourself for these larger impacts, timing your movements around the rhythm of destruction that pounds against your workplace day and night. The most terrifying aspect isn't the immediate danger, but the gradual realization that 3 lighthouse keepers at Island Moor simply vanished during a storm like this one. When the relief keeper arrived after the weather cleared, he found their logs showing they'd experienced severe conditions where waves had damaged equipment 100 feet above normal sea level, but the men themselves were gone without explanation. Their oilskins hung on pegs, their meals sat half-finished on the table, and the lighthouse showed signs of damage from waves that should have been physically impossible. Historians still argue whether they were swept away while attempting emergency repairs outside, or if something even stranger occurred during those final hours when the ocean turned into a vertical landscape of moving water. Your own storm reaches its peak around midnight, when a wave larger than the rest strikes the lighthouse with enough force to crack one of the lantern room's glass panels. Salt water sprays through the opening, threatening the light mechanism, while you desperately try to cover the lens apparatus with canvas sheeting. The wind through the crack creates a shrieking sound that cuts through the storm's general roar, and you realize that maintaining the light might require risking your life to make emergency repairs in conditions where stepping outside would mean instant death. The backup oil lamps keep flickering in the chaotic air currents, and you find yourself holding steady flames with your bare hands while calculating whether it's better to die, trying to fix the damage, or to survive while ships crash on the rocks because your light failed. The storm's aftermath reveals damage that will take months to repair properly, but the light never went out. You discover that several other lighthouses in the region weren't so fortunate their keepers either abandoned their posts during the worst of it or were physically unable to maintain operations. Ships did run aground that night, their crews joining the countless sailors who've learned too late that the ocean doesn't care about human schedules or survival instincts. You spend the following weeks documenting the damage, ordering replacement glass, and trying not to think about how easily you could have joined the vanished keepers of Eilean Moor in the ocean's collection of forgotten stories. The silence hits you first, settling into your bones like a physical weight that grows heavier with each passing day. After the storm's fury subsides and repair work is complete, you discover that isolation isn't just about being alone. It's about the gradual transformation of your relationship with reality itself. The supply ship that visits monthly becomes your calendar marking time in a way that makes weeks blur together into an endless cycle of maintenance, weather watching, and conversations with seabirds who've become your most reliable companions. You find yourself naming the gulls, assigning personalities to the cormorants, and genuinely looking forward to visits from a particular seal who surfaces near the rocks each afternoon around 3 o'clock as if he's checking in on your mental state. The Lighthouse service recognized this problem early enough to establish a rotating library system, sending wooden crates containing several dozen books to each station every 3 months. By 1879, nearly 500 lighthouses participated in this literary lifeline, swapping collections that ranged from technical manuals to adventure novels to religious texts that someone in Washington thought might provide spiritual comfort to isolated keepers. You treasure these book exchanges like Christmas morning, though you quickly learn to ration your reading, finishing the entire collection. Too quickly leaves you with weeks of mental emptiness that can drive a person toward the kind of thoughts that end badly. The books become conversation partners, their characters more real than the distant figures you occasionally spot on passing ships. Your daily routine expands to fill the available time in ways that would seem absurd to people living normal lives on the mainland. Polishing brass fittings becomes a meditative practice that can consume entire afternoons. You develop elaborate systems for organizing supplies, creating inventories that track not just quantities, but the exact position of every tool, spare part, and cleaning cloth in your domain. The government requires detailed logs of weather conditions, ship sightings, and equipment status, but you begin adding personal observations that transform official documentation into something resembling a diary written for an audience of bureaucrats who will never read beyond the required data points. Weather patterns become your primary source of entertainment and intellectual stimulation. You learn to read cloud formations like other people read newspapers, predicting storms hours before they arrive and tracking the subtle seasonal changes that affect visibility conditions. The difference between a force 6 and force 7 wind becomes as meaningful as the difference between comedy and tragedy to a theater critic. You develop theories about how barometric pressure affects the behavior of local wildlife, noting correlations between dropping pressure and increased bird activity that would fascinate meteorologists if you ever had anyone to share these observations with, besides the logbook that preserves them for posterity. The monthly supply ship brings letters that connect you to a world that increasingly feels fictional. News from shore seems to arrive from another planet, where people worry about things like social obligations and career advancement, instead of whether the lens apparatus will survive the next storm. You write lengthy responses to brief messages from family members, pouring weeks of accumulated thoughts into communications that must last until the next mail delivery. Your handwriting changes during these isolated months, becoming more careful and deliberate, as if the physical act of forming letters provides a connection to human civilization that you're desperate to maintain. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers were naturally suited to solitude, or if the job gradually selected for people who could adapt to extreme isolation, but you're living through the transformation that answers that question. Your mind begins creating elaborate internal narratives to fill the conversational void, imaginary discussions with past keepers, detailed fantasies about the lives of people on distant ships, and philosophical debates with yourself about topics that would never occur to someone surrounded by normal human society. The boundary between thinking and talking aloud dissolves gradually until you realize you've been conducting animated conversations with the lighthouse itself, discussing maintenance priorities with the building as if it were a colleague who shares your professional concerns. Sleep becomes irregular as the constant responsibility for the light disrupts normal circadian rhythms. You develop the ability to wake automatically every few hours to check the equipment, but this fragmented sleep schedule affects your perception of time and reality in ways that compound the isolation's psychological effects. You witness the arrival of your first lighthouse family when John Malone brings his wife Julia to manage the Mayor Island light, and you quickly realize that raising children in a glass tower surrounded by endless ocean creates a completely different species of human being. Julia gives birth to 12 babies during their tenure at the Lighthouse 11, of whom survive to adulthood, having never known a world where the horizon isn't perfectly circular and where the sound of crashing waves doesn't provide the constant soundtrack to daily life. These children develop an almost supernatural comfort with heights scrambling up and down the lighthouse stairs, with the casual confidence that most kids reserve for climbing playground equipment, treating the lens room like their personal observatory and the rocky shore as their backyard playground. The logistics of lighthouse family life require creativity that would challenge a military quartermaster. Every supply delivery must account for growing children who need clothes, books, and toys that can survive in an environment where salt air corrodes everything and high winds can turn lightweight objects into dangerous projectiles. You watch Julia establish routines that transform the lighthouse quarters into something resembling a normal home, hanging laundry on lines strung between the tower and auxiliary buildings, creating a kitchen garden in soil imported from the mainland and protected by improvised windbreaks, and establishing school lessons that incorporate lighthouse maintenance as practical education in physics, meteorology, and mechanical engineering. The children's education becomes a family affair where learning to read coincides with learning to read weather patterns, where mathematics lessons involve calculating oil consumption and light timing, and where geography comes alive through identifying distant ships and speculating about their destinations. The oldest Malone boy learns to trim wicks before he learns to tie his shoes, while his sisters master the art of polishing brass fixtures with the kind of precision that takes adult keepers months to develop. These kids grow up thinking that everyone's father climbs a tower every night to light a beacon that guides strangers safely home, and that climbing 6 flights of stairs carrying supplies is just what people do after breakfast. Medical emergencies in lighthouse families require the kind of self-sufficiency that would terrify modern parents. Julia delivers most of her babies with only her husband's assistance and whatever medical supplies can be stored in the lighthouse quarters between supply deliveries. Childhood injuries, and there are plenty because active children and lighthouse equipment create inevitable collision courses, must be treated with whatever materials are available on site. You observe the development of home remedies that combine folk medicine with maritime traditions, creating treatments that work well enough to keep lighthouse families functional until serious medical attention becomes available during supply runs or emergency evacuations. The isolation affects lighthouse children differently than their parents, creating personalities that seem perfectly adapted to solitude while remaining capable of normal social interaction during their rare encounters with mainland life. They develop intense relationships with pets. Lighthouse cats become essential for rodent control while providing companionship for children who might go weeks without seeing another child. These cats evolve their own adaptations to lighthouse life, learning to navigate stairs with loads of fish caught from the rocks, and developing the kind of sea legs that would impress experienced sailors. Historians still argue whether lighthouse children received better or worse educations than their mainland counterparts. But the evidence suggests these kids developed unusually broad practical skills combined with deep knowledge of subjects that interested them. With limited books and unlimited time, lighthouse children often became experts in whatever subjects their family's rotating library happened to emphasize. Some became naturalists who could identify every species of seabird and marine life in their region. Others developed mathematical abilities through constant exposure to the precise calculations required for lighthouse maintenance, and many became accomplished writers whose detailed letters to mainland relatives provide some of our best records of lighthouse family life. The seasonal rhythms of lighthouse families revolve around the supply schedule in ways that create anticipation and celebration, unknown to people with regular access to stores and services. Supply ship arrival becomes Christmas birthday party and town festival rolled into one event that the entire family spends weeks preparing for and days recovering from. Children learn to make requests months in advance for items that mainland kids could obtain with a simple trip to town, developing patience and planning skills that serve them well in adult life, whether they choose maritime careers or return to landlubber existence. You learn the unwritten code of lighthouse rescue work during your first emergency when a fishing vessel capsizes just beyond the breakers, and you realize that saving lives often means risking your own in conditions that would make experienced lifeguards reconsider their career choices. The small rowboat you use for supply runs and mainland trips suddenly becomes a life or death rescue vehicle that must navigate waves designed to smash wooden boats against rocks with the efficiency of industrial machinery. Your hands shake as you untie the mooring lines, not from cold, but from the mathematical certainty that this rescue attempt has better than even odds of adding your name to the list of lighthouse keepers who died at trying to help others survive the ocean's casual cruelty. Ida Lewis becomes your inspiration and your nightmare, demonstrating both the heroic potential and terrifying risks of lighthouse rescue work. Starting at age 12, she rows out into dangerous waters to save drowning sailors with the kind of casual competence that makes her rescue total of 24 people seem almost routine until you consider that each incident required her to risk everything for complete strangers. Her rescue of 2 soldiers and a 14-year-old boy from icy March waters illustrates the brutal arithmetic of maritime rescue. Despite her best efforts, the boy dies in the frigid water while she manages to save the 2 adults, proving that courage and skill don't guarantee success when hypothermia and drowning work faster than even the most determined rescue efforts. Your own rescue attempts teach you why lighthouse keepers develop the kind of fatalistic attitude that treats death as an occupational hazard rather than a remote possibility. The ocean doesn't negotiate, doesn't provide second chances, and doesn't care about your good intentions when waves are running 12 feet high and the temperature hovers just above freezing. You learn to calculate rescue scenarios with the cold precision of an engineer weighing the probability of success against the certainty of creating additional victims if your boat capsizes during the attempt. Sometimes, the most heroic decision is choosing not to attempt a rescue that would only add lighthouse keeper casualties to an already tragic situation. The equipment available for rescue work ranges from barely adequate to completely insufficient, depending on your lighthouse's location and budget allocation. Your rescue boat might be a sturdy dory designed for heavy weather, or it could be a lightweight skiff that's perfectly adequate for calm water supply runs, but becomes a floating death trap when pressed into emergency service during storms. The rope and tackle systems, meant to help pull survivors from the water, work well in theory, but require the kind of precise coordination that becomes nearly impossible when you're fighting seasickness while trying to grab hold of panicking people who may unconsciously try to drown you in their desperation to survive. The psychological aftermath of rescue attempts, both successful and failed, creates emotional burdens that compound the isolation and stress of lighthouse keeping. Successful rescues bring temporary satisfaction, followed by the knowledge that you'll eventually face another emergency where the outcome might be different. Failed rescues leave you replaying every decision, wondering if different timing or tactics might have saved lives that were lost while you watched helplessly from your boat. The survivors you do manage to save rarely stay in contact afterward, leaving you with brief moments of human connection that highlight the loneliness of your regular existence. Weather conditions during maritime emergencies consistently range from challenging to impossible because ships rarely get into serious trouble during calm conditions when rescue would be straightforward. You find yourself attempting rescues in precisely the weather conditions that make lighthouse keeping dangerous: high winds, limited visibility, irregular waves that can flip small boats without warning, and water temperatures that kill within minutes, even if you manage to avoid drowning. The irony isn't lost on you that the storms which make lighthouse beacons most necessary also make rescue operations most likely to fail catastrophically. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers had any official obligation to attempt rescues, or if this duty evolved informally through maritime tradition and personal conscience. But you discover that the distinction becomes meaningless when you're watching people die within sight of your lighthouse. The government regulations focus on maintaining the light and recording weather data, but the unwritten expectations of coastal communities assume that lighthouse keepers will risk everything to save lives when the opportunity arises, creating moral pressure that transforms rescue work from voluntary heroism into expected duty that could define your reputation for decades. You discover that running a lighthouse according to government specifications requires mastering an 87-page manual containing 131 separate tasks, each described with the kind of bureaucratic precision that suggests the regulations were written by people who've never been closer to the ocean than a Washington, D.C. bathtub. The 1858 edition of Lighthouse Keeper Guidelines reads like a cross between an engineering textbook and a legal document, specifying everything from the exact angle for trimming lamp wicks to the proper method for recording weather observations in handwriting that must remain legible even when your hands are shaking from exhaustion or mercury poisoning. You quickly learn that lighthouse keeping involves as much paperwork as actual lighthouse maintenance, with daily logs, weekly reports, monthly inventories, and emergency documentation that must be completed regardless of weather conditions or personal health crises. The government's obsession with standardization creates absurd situations where lighthouse keepers in tropical climates receive identical supply shipments to those stationed in Arctic conditions, resulting in deliveries of winter gear to lighthouses where the temperature never drops below 60 degrees, while stations in northern regions struggle with inadequate heating supplies during blizzards that last for weeks. The bureaucratic mind that creates these policies operates from offices where the biggest weather concern is whether to carry an umbrella, leading to regulations that sound perfectly reasonable on paper, but become dangerously impractical when implemented by people whose lives depend on the equipment actually working in real-world conditions. Supply requisitions require navigating a procurement system designed by administrators who apparently believe that lighthouse keepers can predict their needs months in advance with mathematical precision. You submit detailed requests for everything from lamp oil to replacement glass panels, only to receive substitutions that technically meet the specifications while being completely unsuitable for actual use. The weatherproof paint that arrives in your supply shipment might work perfectly well for painting government buildings in mild climates, but it peels off lighthouse exteriors within weeks when subjected to salt spray and hurricane-force winds, leading to endless correspondence with officials who insist that you must be applying it incorrectly. The inspection system sends government representatives who arrive during perfect weather conditions to evaluate lighthouse operations based on criteria that emphasize appearance over functionality. These inspectors examine brass fittings for proper polish while ignoring the improvised repairs that keep critical equipment operational during emergencies. They measure the distance between paintbrush strokes on exterior walls while failing to understand why certain maintenance procedures must be modified to account for local weather patterns that don't exist in the regulation manual. You learn to prepare for inspections by creating the appearance of perfect compliance while hiding the practical adaptations that actually keep your lighthouse functional. Weather reporting requirements demand hourly observations that must be transmitted via telegraph or radio, regardless of atmospheric conditions that make communication equipment unreliable. You find yourself climbing to the top of the lighthouse during thunderstorms to record wind speeds that are too high for your instruments to measure accurately, then attempting to transmit this data through communication systems that fail precisely when the information becomes most valuable. The meteorological data collected by lighthouse keepers provides crucial information for weather prediction, but the collection process requires risking electrocution and structural collapse during the very storms that make the data most important. Budget allocations reflect the government's fundamental misunderstanding of lighthouse operational costs, providing funding based on theoretical calculations that ignore the reality of equipment failure rates in maritime environments. Replacement parts cost 3 times the budgeted amount because they must be manufactured to withstand conditions that destroy normal equipment within months. Transportation costs for emergency repairs exceed annual supply budgets when storms damage equipment that can't wait for the next scheduled delivery. You learn to become an expert in improvised engineering, creating temporary solutions from whatever materials happen to be available while waiting for official replacement parts that may take months to arrive through proper procurement channels. Historians still argue whether the Lighthouse Service's elaborate bureaucracy improved safety and efficiency, or simply created employment for administrators who had no practical understanding of maritime operations. But you experience firsthand how regulations designed to ensure accountability often interfere with the flexibility required to maintain lighthouse operations under constantly changing conditions. The paperwork requirements alone consume hours that could be spent on actual maintenance, while the standardized procedures ignore local variations that make each lighthouse unique in its operational challenges and requirements. You witness history being made when Rebecca Flaherty becomes the first federally appointed female lighthouse keeper, but only after President Thomas Jefferson's infamous declaration that the appointment of a woman to office is an innovation for which the public is not prepared, nor am I, blocks Rebecca Long from taking over her deceased husband's position despite her months of competent service. The irony isn't lost on you that women often prove more capable lighthouse keepers than their male counterparts, having spent years assisting with duties while raising families in the demanding lighthouse environment. Yet political prejudice requires them to prove their qualifications repeatedly, while men receive appointments based purely on their gender and presumed authority over maritime affairs. Hannah Thomas shatters the precedent in 1776 when she takes over the Gurnet Point Lighthouse after her husband John dies of smallpox while serving simultaneously as lighthouse keeper and Continental Army soldier. Her decade-long tenure demonstrates that women can master every aspect of lighthouse operation, from lens maintenance to weather observation. But her achievement remains largely forgotten because acknowledging female competence in such positions challenges assumptions about gender roles that persist well into the 19th century. You observe how women lighthouse keepers develop innovative solutions to challenges that male keepers simply endure, approaching problems with practical creativity that often produces better results than traditional methods. Ida Lewis transforms lighthouse keeping from a male-dominated profession into a demonstration of female capability that earns national recognition impossible to ignore. Her 24 documented rescues, and probably many more that never made newspaper headlines, prove that courage and seamanship have nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character and skill. When critics argue that her rescue work is unladylike, she responds with characteristic directness. None but a donkey would consider it unfeminine to save lives. Her appointment as lighthouse keeper comes with the highest salary in the service officially, in consideration of the remarkable services in the saving of lives, but really because her achievements make gender-based discrimination impossible to justify publicly. The practical advantages of female lighthouse keepers become apparent when you observe their approach to the job's domestic requirements. Lighthouse stations need constant cleaning, cooking, and household management, in addition to technical maintenance, and women arrive already possessing skills that male keepers must learn through trial and error. They establish gardens that supplement food supplies more successfully than most male attempts manage family resources with efficiency that stretches supply deliveries between scheduled shipments and create living environments that maintain morale during the psychological challenges of isolation and confinement. Family lighthouse operations often depend more heavily on wives than husbands, though official records credit men with accomplishments that result from collaborative effort. Women manage the complex logistics of raising children while maintaining lighthouse equipment, coordinate rescue efforts, while men operate boats and maintain detailed records that often surpass government requirements for thoroughness and accuracy. You notice that lighthouse stations run by female keepers consistently receive better inspection ratings and fewer emergency repair requests, suggesting that their management approach produces superior operational results, regardless of official recognition. The transition from male to female lighthouse keeping occurs gradually as maritime authorities realize that competence matters more than conforming to social expectations about appropriate employment for women. Lighthouse keeping requires exactly the skills that women develop through domestic responsibilities: attention to detail, ability to manage multiple tasks simultaneously, capability to maintain equipment, through careful cleaning and maintenance, rather than brute force repairs and psychological resilience to handle isolation and stress without abandoning essential duties. The job's combination of technical and domestic requirements actually favors candidates with traditionally feminine skills over those who rely primarily on physical strength. Historians still argue whether female lighthouse keepers received equal treatment and compensation compared to their male counterparts, but the evidence suggests that once appointed women often outperformed men in measurable ways while receiving less recognition and advancement opportunity. The Lighthouse Service's gradual acceptance of female keepers represents one of the earliest examples of women entering a previously male profession based purely on demonstrated competence rather than social reform movements or political pressure proving that practical necessity can overcome gender prejudice when lives and property depend on job performance rather than conformity to social expectations. You watch the beginning of the end when the first electric lighthouse appears on the horizon, its steady LED beam cutting through fog with mechanical precision that makes your oil-burning, wick-trimming, Mercury-splashing operation look like a museum exhibit from the age of sailing ships. The technological revolution arrives gradually at first: better oils, improved lens designs, more efficient lamp mechanisms, but accelerates rapidly once electric power becomes reliable enough to operate in maritime environments where salt air corrodes everything, and power failures mean ships full of people dying on rocks that were perfectly avoidable with proper illumination. Your carefully developed skills in flame management and lens polishing suddenly become as obsolete as knowing how to shoe horses in an age of automobiles. The GPS system delivers the final blow to lighthouse relevance, transforming navigation from an art requiring local knowledge and careful observation into a simple matter of following electronic instructions that work regardless of weather conditions, time of day, or the navigator's experience level. Ships that once depended on your beacon for survival now carry equipment that can pinpoint their location within feet anywhere on the planet, making lighthouses as unnecessary as Stone Age tools in a digital workshop. You realize that centuries of maritime tradition and accumulated lighthouse keeper knowledge are becoming historical curiosities rather than essential life-saving skills preserved only in museums and the increasingly rare installations that maintain traditional equipment for sentimental rather than practical reasons. The automation process transforms lighthouses from human-operated beacons into remote-controlled installations that function more reliably than manual systems while eliminating the need for on-site personnel entirely. Solar panels replace fuel deliveries, LED arrays replace flame management, and computer-controlled rotation systems replace the Mercury float mechanisms that drove previous generations of lighthouse keepers slowly insane. The new systems operate for years without human intervention, reporting their status via radio links to control centers where technicians monitor dozens of installations from comfortable offices hundreds of miles away from salt spray and hurricane force winds. The economic arguments for automation become overwhelming once reliable technology proves capable of matching human performance while eliminating salary costs, housing maintenance supply deliveries, and the constant risk of lighthouse keepers being killed or injured during routine operations. A single technician with a helicopter can service multiple automated lighthouses in less time than it takes one traditional keeper to complete daily maintenance routines at a single station. The bean counters who make budget decisions see only the numbers millions of dollars in annual savings, with improved reliability and reduced liability, while completely ignoring the cultural significance of ending a profession that connected human dedication to maritime safety for over 2,000 years. Your fellow lighthouse keepers respond to technological displacement with the mixture of resignation and defiance typical of workers whose skills become obsolete through progress they can't control or prevent. Some embrace early retirement, grateful to escape the isolation and physical demands that have dominated their working lives. Others fight the transition, arguing that human judgment and local knowledge provide safety margins that automated systems can't replicate, especially during extreme weather conditions when equipment failures become most dangerous and most likely to occur simultaneously with navigation emergencies. The transition period creates hybrid systems where traditional lighthouse keepers work alongside automated equipment, maintaining backup systems and providing human oversight for computer-controlled operations. You learn to monitor electronic displays instead of polishing brass fixtures, to troubleshoot solid-state circuits instead of trimming lamp wicks, and to communicate with distant control centers instead of maintaining detailed handwritten logs. The work becomes less physically demanding, but more technically complex, requiring new skills while making traditional lighthouse keeper knowledge irrelevant except for historical interpretation. Historians still argue whether lighthouse automation represents genuine progress or the loss of valuable human elements in maritime safety systems, but the statistical evidence strongly favors automated operations for reliability, cost-effectiveness, and reduced risk to human operators. Modern LED lighthouse systems operate for decades with minimal maintenance while providing illumination that surpasses anything achievable with traditional flame-based technology. The romance of lighthouse keeping survives in literature and tourism, but the practical necessity that created the profession has been eliminated by technologies that perform better while costing less and endangering no one's life or sanity. You discover that lighthouse keeping hasn't completely disappeared, but is transformed into something your 19th century predecessors would barely recognize surviving in remote Canadian outposts, where 50 lighthouses still employ human keepers who function more as weather monitoring stations and emergency response coordinators than traditional beacon operators. These modern lighthouse keepers wake at 3 in the morning not to trim wicks and carry oil, but to check automated LED systems and transmit meteorological data to airports and shipping companies that depend on real-time weather observations from locations where satellites and automated sensors can't capture the subtle variations that determine whether conditions are safe for navigation or aviation. The daily routine of contemporary lighthouse keepers reflects the profession's evolution from manual labor to technical monitoring, but the isolation and responsibility remain unchanged from your historical experience. Maxwell Gordon, maintaining a lighthouse in the 21st century, follows a schedule that begins with pre-dawn weather checks and radio transmissions, continues through daylight hours of maintenance and observation, and ends with evening reports that must be completed regardless of personal health or weather conditions. His lighthouse operates entirely on solar power with battery backup systems eliminating the need for fuel deliveries while creating new dependencies on electronic equipment that requires different skills but similar dedication to reliable operation. The weather reporting function has become the primary justification for maintaining human lighthouse keepers in an age of automated navigation systems because pilots and ship captains still need human observations during marginal conditions when automated sensors provide ambiguous data about visibility, wind patterns, and sea states. A computer can measure wind speed and direction with mathematical precision, but only human eyes can evaluate whether fog banks are thick enough to require flight cancellations, or whether wave patterns indicate conditions too dangerous for small craft operations. These judgment calls based on experience, rather than algorithms, continue to save lives in situations where automated systems would provide technically accurate but practically useless information. The rescue function persists as well, though modern lighthouse keepers coordinate with professional search and rescue teams rather than launching solo rescue attempts in small boats. When emergencies occur, lighthouse stations serve as communication hubs and observation posts that guide rescue helicopters and Coast Guard vessels to accident locations that might be difficult to locate from distant bases. The lighthouse keeper's intimate knowledge of local currents, weather patterns, and navigation hazards provides crucial information that can make the difference between successful rescues and recovery operations for bodies that wash ashore weeks later. Modern lighthouse keeper positions require technical skills that would mystify traditional keepers, computer operation, radio communication protocols, meteorological instrument calibration, and solar power system maintenance, while preserving the essential character traits of isolation, tolerance, mechanical aptitude, and absolute reliability that defined the profession throughout its history. The pay ranges from $30,000 to $60,000 annually, which sounds modest until you consider that lighthouse keepers live rent-free with utilities provided and have limited opportunities to spend money in locations where the nearest store might be a helicopter flight away. The application process for modern lighthouse keeping positions reflects the profession's scarcity and desirability among people seeking escape from conventional employment. Candidates typically start as relief workers rotating between stations when permanent keepers need vacation time or medical leave, sometimes spending years in temporary assignments before permanent positions become available. The Canadian Lighthouse Service, one of the few organizations still employing lighthouse keepers, can afford to be selective in choosing candidates who demonstrate both technical competence and psychological suitability for extended isolation in challenging environments. Historians still argue whether maintaining human lighthouse keepers serves genuine practical purposes or represents expensive nostalgia for maritime traditions that modern technology has rendered obsolete. But the persistence of the profession in certain locations suggests that human judgment and presence continue to provide value that automated systems can't replicate entirely. The lighthouse keepers who maintain these final stations represent the end of a profession that once employed thousands of people worldwide, carrying forward traditions and responsibilities that connect them directly to centuries of maritime history while adapting to technological realities that their predecessors could never have imagined. The lighthouse beam continues to sweep across dark waters, each night no longer essential for navigation, but still serving as a symbol of human dedication to guiding others safely through dangerous passages, whether those dangers are physical rocks that can sink ships or the metaphorical storms that make life itself a treacherous journey, requiring beacons of reliability and hope. Now the ocean grows quieter around you, its endless rhythm becoming a gentle lullaby that carries away the day's concerns, like retreating waves smoothing sand. The lighthouse beam continues its patient rotation, painting brief moments of illumination across the darkness before moving on, leaving only the soft whisper of wind and water to fill the silence. You can almost hear the echoes of all those lighthouse keepers who came before their footsteps on spiral staircases, their voices calling weather reports into radio transmissions that fade into the vast night sky. The profession may be nearly extinct, but something essential persists in those final lighthouse stations where dedicated individuals still climb towers each morning to ensure that lights shine for travelers who may need guidance through uncertain passages. Perhaps that's what lighthouse keeping was always really about. Not just the technical maintenance of beacons and lenses, but the human commitment to being present in dark places where others might lose their way, offering steady light and reliable assistance to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to venture into waters that don't forgive mistakes or reward good intentions. The waves continue their ancient conversation with the shore, speaking in a language older than lighthouses, older than ships, older than the first humans who learned to read the stars for navigation. In that eternal rhythm, you can find the same peace that lighthouse keepers discovered during quiet moments between emergencies, when the light burned steady and the sea stretched endlessly toward horizons that promised both adventure and safe harbor for those who learned to respect the ocean's power while appreciating its terrible beauty.